This was a setup. Marcus's strangled shout broke through as he realized his team had fallen into a trap. The cartel in New Mexico were not the disorganized criminals they had expected, but disciplined fighters, trained with precision. Within mere minutes, the SEALs were driven into a dead corner. No one was coming to save them. No one could hear their cries. And just as the countdown clock ticked down to their final minutes of survival, an unknown female voice suddenly shattered the silence, opening a path to life that no one had dared imagine. 8 minutes to die. That line had barely faded from the intro screen when the story pulled back, revealing fragments of ordinary life in America, the place where our characters were shaped. Lieutenant Marcus Hale, commander of a SEAL team, had once been a living legend in Afghanistan. In the harshest years of war, his comrades called him the combat machine because he never tired, never retreated, and seemed incapable of fear. In night raids, in split-second assaults where everything was measured in heartbeats, Marcus was always the first to surge forward. Bullets might rip past his shoulder, grenades might detonate at his side, but people always saw him rise again, quietly brushing off the dust, as if it were nothing more than a stumble on an ordinary day. Yet back in America, all the glory seemed folded away, locked in a cabinet no one ever opened. At Coronado, his name rarely appeared in official reports. The feats he had carved out on the battlefield gradually survived only in the whispers of old comrades. Out there, on television, America celebrated polished faces in dress uniforms gleaming with medals, while Marcus, in a crowd, looked like nothing more than a shadow in a worn-out uniform. Someone once told him, "You're like a silenced gun. Everyone knows it exists, but nobody pays attention to it anymore." He had laughed, half in jest, half in truth. At least a silenced gun still does its job. In another corner of America, nearly 1,200 miles from Coronado, Eleanor Brooks sat behind a wall of monitors in the signal analysis room at Kirtland, New Mexico. Her entire day revolved around invisible currents, flickering radios, blinking satellite feeds, frequencies most people would never hear. If Marcus was the embodiment of raw strength on the front lines, Eleanor was the emblem of the silent shadows. Her colleagues in the base gave her a nickname, half teasing, half sincere, the Ghost Analyst. Not because she was dangerous, but because she was almost invisible. She rarely left the analysis room, seldom showed up in the mess hall, and nearly no one could remember her face if they happened to cross paths in the hallway. At unit gatherings, when others swapped stories of courage in combat, Eleanor sat quietly at the end of the table, listening to the laughter echo like waves crashing against a distant shore she might never set foot on. And yet for those who truly paid attention, her eyes revealed something different, an unwavering steadiness, as if every number, every invisible signal carried a soul, and she was bound to protect it at all costs. On her desk, Eleanor always kept an old, battered compass. It had once belonged to her father, a U.S. Air Force pilot, who never returned from a mission in Iraq. To others, it was just a piece of tarnished metal, scratched and aged. But to Eleanor, it was the only guiding star in a chaotic world. She had a ritual. At the end of every shift, she would gently spin the compass needle, watching it tremble before it settled on north. Sometimes colleagues caught her and teased, checking if the Earth is still spinning on its axis. Eleanor would give a faint smile, her eyes glinting mischievously. "Just making sure the planet hasn't tilted off course." That touch of wit lightened the heavy air. But it also revealed something deeper, though labeled a shadow. She never let herself lose clarity, or the sliver of humor required to endure. In American society, statues are raised for heroes on the battlefield, but few notice the ones bent over in the shadows, carrying the unseen weight of war. Eleanor was one of them. Just like Marcus, two people who seemed so different yet shared one common fate. Both existed on the margins of headlines and grand broadcasts. One had once blazed brightly in combat but was forgotten upon returning. The other had never been named at all, though she worked each day to keep the world steady on frequencies no one else could hear. The question is, when destiny throws them into the same battle, when only a handful of minutes stand between life and death, what truths will be revealed from these so-called shadows? In the signal analysis room, bathed in the faint blue glow of monitors, Eleanor Brooks sat still, like a shadow. In that place, where every sound was nothing but dry beeps and static interference, silence could weigh so heavily it felt suffocating. She was used to it. For Eleanor, it was within that very silence that the most important secrets often appeared. Rumors about Eleanor were scarce, but on a military base where gossip thrived, even the smallest story could be magnified into something mysterious. They said her father had once been a combat pilot in the Air Force, killed in action before she was even 10 years old. His death left in Eleanor not only a void in her family, but also a mark that would forever shape the way she looked at the world. On her desk, she kept a single keepsake, an old compass, its metal edges tarnished, its glass face scratched. It held no material value, yet it was like an invisible thread tying her to the past. Sometimes, in the middle of long, dragging shifts, when radio signals went completely dead, she would turn the needle ever so slightly. It always quivered for a moment before settling north, as if to remind her, even when everything else lost its direction, there was still one true path. Her colleagues found the habit peculiar. They would shake their heads, tossing off a joke. Eleanor, checking if the earth is still spinning on its axis? She would simply smile faintly, her eyes glimmering with a playful spark, replying with her gaze rather than words. In a place hardened by data and procedures, that sliver of humor was enough for people to remember her, if only for a brief second. But then, like a short-lived blip flashing across a radar screen, her presence seemed to vanish once more. Most of the time, Eleanor's name was one rarely spoken. In large meetings, she would sit in the back row, head bent over her notebook, never raising her voice. Yet for anyone perceptive enough, one glance at her eyes fixed on the rows of frequencies revealed something rare. An unyielding steadiness, absolute focus. She did not view radio waves as cold numbers, but as the heartbeats of those out there in the field. In Eleanor's mind, every flicker on the main screen was a human life waiting for guidance. One night during a late shift, when her teammates were nodding off with stifled yawns, Eleanor sat motionless before the monitors. A young officer walked by, curious about the old compass. He chuckled softly. "Is that just for decoration?" Eleanor didn't answer right away. She turned the needle once, let it spin, then said lightly, "At least, it has never betrayed me." It wasn't exactly a reply, more like a fragment left behind. From that night on, the young officer never joked about it again. In an environment where most people competed to be recognized, Eleanor had no concern for recognition. She had no photo hanging on any honor wall, no story retold at a medal ceremony. The only thing she carried was an unshakable loyalty not to rank or to system, but to the lives of those out there, betting everything on the fragile signals she monitored. That was something few ever noticed. But it was precisely that quietness which defined Eleanor's strength. When the world fell silent, she became the only ear that listened. When every map turned useless, that old compass would still point true north. And when someone's fate hung suspended in the night, Eleanor was the one who knew how to keep the signal from vanishing entirely. A rare friend once teased that Eleanor had a superpower, the ability to make herself invisible until the world truly needed her. Eleanor laughed, but deep inside she knew it wasn't wrong. She had never sought to be seen. She only hoped that when the day finally came, she would be calm enough not to step back. In the base's corridors, teammates could walk right past without realizing she had been there. Yet in a moment of life and death, when the radios suddenly went dead, perhaps it was that very invisibility that would change everything. The last light of day descended over the Sangre de Cristo Valley, stretching streaks of orange-red across the sky like scars torn into the horizon. For many, it was nothing more than an ordinary sunset in the American Southwest. But for Marcus Hale's SEAL team, It felt like the final curtain falling before a bloody play. At first, the mission had been labeled as routine reconnaissance, a small weapons cache, a few scattered cartel squads, and a planned withdrawal within 3 hours. Yet only 10 minutes after setting foot in the valley, Marcus realized he had been deceived. The enemy was not chaotic. They moved with discipline, signaled with hand gestures instead of shouts, and kept their spacing precise, like military units drilled to perfection. These were no ordinary traffickers. This was a carefully orchestrated ambush. Dry, cracking blasts erupted from the ridge. Bullets slammed into the earth, kicking up red dust in violent columns. The SEAL formation immediately dispersed, taking cover behind rocks, eyes scanning frantically for an escape route. But through the haze of gunfire, Marcus saw the grim truth. All 3 exits out of the valley were blocked. Armored pickup trucks loomed in the fading light, like steel traps sprung shut across every path. The radios sputtered with static, then fell silent. Their communications were completely jammed. Digital maps on the chest-mounted screens turned useless, showing nothing but a gray void of death. Tools that once gave them confidence now offered only silence, like the valley itself was swallowing them whole. In the dim twilight, one of the younger soldiers slipped, muttering a quiet curse as he fell. The sound was small, yet oddly humanizing. In the chaos of battle, that stumble was a fleeting reminder. They were still men, not machines. Marcus let out a brief, rasping chuckle, the sound catching in his throat, then gripped his weapon tighter. Ammunition dwindled quickly, every round spent with precise calculation, but the enemy was more numerous, better equipped. From the ridgelines, machine guns thundered down, heavy, deliberate, and unrelenting. Sweat poured beneath their body armor, mixing with dust, streaking faces with smeared lines of grime. A sharp cry escaped as Corporal Gomez took a bullet to the shoulder. Blood soaked through a makeshift bandage. The strained breathing of the wounded thickened the air with dread. The combat medics worked furiously, but even they knew, without a way out, their efforts were nothing but a stopgap before the inevitable. Marcus swept his gaze across the valley, where the sun sank fast behind the peaks. The light weakened, shadows crept in, and with them came the final chance to survive. But in his mind, every possibility slammed shut. No escape, no reinforcements, only time, slipping away in the pounding rhythm of his heart. In that moment, Marcus's memory flashed back to Afghanistan. Once, stranded in the desert without a map, an older soldier had joked, "If you don't know where north is, just walk toward the Sunday. At the very least, it'll take you somewhere new." Back then, the team had laughed hard, turning the line into an inside joke. But now, the memory returned with a bitter sting. This time, no sun was bright enough to lead them home. Gun smoke, red dust, the labored groans of comrades, all of it fused into a scene every soldier dreads, trapped in a sealed valley. Tactics, years of training, all seemed powerless against an enemy plan executed with ruthless precision. Each second dragged by, hope flickering out like embers swept away in the wind. What began as a simple reconnaissance had twisted into a death trap. And in the suffocating silence of the jammed radio, only the pounding of soldiers' hearts remained thudding faster and faster, as if warning them all of the same truth. The end was drawing near. Dear audience, grab a glass of water, take a moment to relax, and keep listening to the story. The twists are still to come. And please drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a joy to see who's joining us from around the world. Drop a 1 in the comments if you find this story gripping, so we can keep bringing you more captivating tales. In the air, thick with the acrid stench of gunpowder, amid pounding heartbeats and the metallic clatter of shell casings striking stone, a radio frequency suddenly crackled to life. The first sound was not the usual static, but a calm, firm female voice so clear it felt as if she were standing right behind them. "Ghost 11, on your 6. Marcus froze. The voice was cold, yet oddly reassuring. No one on the team had ever heard that name before. There were no files, no instructions from command, no mention in the mission brief. And yet, almost immediately, the voice began issuing orders. Short, precise, unwavering. 3 o'clock. East elevation 120 feet. Left side, behind the boulder. A shooter has you in his sights. Move through the northwest pass. There's a way out. Each directive was so accurate, it was staggering. One of the younger SEALs, whose hands had been trembling moments earlier as blood seeped through his bandage, squeezed the trigger on her command, and exactly as she said, an enemy sniper dropped instantly. The tension, strung tight as wire, slackened just slightly. The danger remained. The trap still coiled around them, but at least now they knew. Some invisible set of eyes was watching over them, some mind calculating faster than instinct itself. Marcus glanced at his men. In their eyes flickered both fear and doubt. Trusting a nameless voice, appearing from nowhere, this was gambling their lives on blind faith. Yet with death pressing in and fragile hope the only currency left, they had no choice. They chose to believe. The next bursts of gunfire rang out, no longer wild, chaotic shots, each round now guided by the steady calm flowing through the frequency. A path forward began to open. Then came a strange, almost comic twist. As they crawled through a narrow crevice, one of the larger SEALs slipped, crashing into the dirt with a thud that echoed like a sack of potatoes tumbling off a truck. For the briefest moment, the entire team chuckled an absurd, fleeting laugh in the jaws of hell, like a small aspirin dulling a relentless pain. The female voice on the radio seemed to pause for a beat, then resumed her commands, steady and measured, betraying no emotion. Her composure flowed into them. They moved faster now, tighter, as if an unseen hand were pulling them out of the death trap. Marcus, a commander who had led dozens of battles, had never experienced anything so strange. He didn't know the name, didn't know the face, yet felt an unshakable trust. In those brief minutes, something shifted. The SEALs were no longer alone. Out there, across the invisible layers of frequency, someone was fighting beside them. But in Marcus's mind, questions burned hotter with every step. Who could pierce through the dense wall of signal jamming? Who had the knowledge to pinpoint enemy positions in the dark? And most of all, why choose to call herself Ghost 11? The answers would not come in that night's chaos. Ahead of them, bullets still tore through the air. But now, every step forward was no longer blind. The invisible voice had become their compass, precise, unwavering, and unshakable. Everything that followed unfolded like a chess game in which every piece had already been placed. Guided by the mysterious female voice, each SEAL became a link in a chain of movements so precise it seemed impossible. Marcus swept his eyes east. At that exact moment, the instruction came through his headset. 200 feet, left side. He squeezed the trigger. A spark flared on the ridgeline, and the shadow preparing to target his teammate dropped instantly. Not a second was wasted. The moment that shot ended, the voice returned calm, sharp, resolute. Hold steady, the wind is shifting. The team's sniper adjusted his scope, waited half a beat, and fired. Another gap opened in the tightening noose. So it went, each clipped directive like a lifeline, pulling them step by step out of the valley that had been turning into a grave. In the darkness, they followed a rocky stream. The icy water soaked through their pant legs, mingling with the smell of blood, but to them it was a sign of life. Where water flowed, a way forward remained. Gomez, his shoulder torn by a bullet, was carried on a comrade's back. He muttered curses, half from pain, half to keep himself conscious. Another soldier chuckled. "Keep complaining, Gomez. As long as you're griping, you're not dead yet." The squad broke into rough, ragged laughter, strained but precious, like lighting a small candle in the thickness of night. Every step was a burden. Yet the woman's voice in their radios never faltered. She gave bearings, reported the wind, even told them when to pause for breath. The way she spoke, cold as steel, yet strangely gentle, made disbelief impossible. They scrambled across a rock slide. Suddenly, a torrent of machine gun fire tore open behind them. Dust exploded into clouds. A round slammed into the dirt at Marcus's feet, hurling shards of stone. In the instant that felt like their end, the voice cut through again. Right side, get low. Now. The squad dropped as one, like a wave collapsing. Bullets stitched into the cliff face behind them, leaving streaks of fire in the dark. When the dust settled, they were still alive. One young SEAL whispered between ragged breaths, "She really is a ghost." No one disagreed, because in truth she was. Time shrank into heartbeats. Each minute dragged as heavy as a lifetime. But gradually, they realized the ring of steel around them was thinning. Rifles no longer glared from every angle. Enemy flashlights retreated, dimming in the dark. At last, crawling through the Northwest Pass, they emerged into a wide-open sky. The New Mexico night glittered with stars, so still it almost made them forget they had just escaped hell. In that moment, Marcus felt as if he was breathing for the first time after hours underwater. Then, from far off, a sound rose low, familiar. Whump, whump, whump. The pounding blades of a Black Hawk helicopter slicing through the night. They looked at one another, hardly daring to believe. One muttered, "If this is a dream, don't wake me up." The Black Hawk swept in, its white beam cutting across the valley. The team waved signals, hauling one another toward the light. When the bay door opened, a rush of wind slammed their faces, but no one complained. It was the wind of life itself. When the last heavy body was dragged aboard, they all collapsed, drenched in sweat and blood, clinging to their armor. No words were spoken, none were needed. The truth was undeniable. They were alive. Marcus turned to the open hatch. The Sangre de Cristo Valley lay in darkness below, punctuated only by faint red sparks of tracer fire. He knew, without that mysterious female voice, they would have been left there forever, just names crossed out in a sterile report. The SEALs had always been taught that trust is not in the manual, yet that night it was trust in an unseen voice that brought them home. Back at Kirtland Base, the helicopter door had barely shut when silence filled the cabin. The soldiers who had just escaped death sat wordless, each of them aware they had narrowly evaded an inevitable end. But once their boots hit the landing pad, that raw awareness was quickly replaced by something else: paperwork, procedures, reports. The official report was brutally brief, cold in its detachment. SEAL team escaped encirclement, no fatalities. A sterile line, no different from a maintenance log. No mention of the gunfire that pinned them down, no note of the mysterious guidance, and certainly no reference to the name Ghost 11. To those behind desks, that harrowing ordeal was nothing more than a dot on the mission map. But in the hallways, in the break rooms, and across online forums for veterans, the story spread along another path. The whispers said, "A woman's voice saved the whole team." And from somewhere, somehow, the nickname emerged, the 11th Ghost. In the mess hall, young soldiers retold it with shining eyes, as if they had glimpsed a legend. At the coffee stand, seasoned officers muttered the tale, skeptical yet intrigued. One joked, "Maybe it was just Siri, upgraded." The quip drew laughter around the table, lifting some of the weight. Yet everyone knew, behind the laughter, lingered a truth too hard to dismiss. Someone had intervened, and no one knew why. Marcus Hale, the commander, could not accept that everything would simply be erased. He sought out Eleanor Brooks. The signal analysis room was unchanged, cold, lit by the weary hum of fluorescent lamps. On the desk lay the same old compass, its needle trembling faintly as if it were breathing. Eleanor sat behind the monitors, her eyes unblinking, hands clasped together. When Marcus entered, she did not look at him. She only set the compass on the table and said softly, "Sometimes, the only true direction is breaking the silence." No more words were needed. Marcus understood. And he understood too that within a system built to worship rules and procedures, people like Eleanor would always be relegated to the shadows. Yet he also knew this: without that one breach of protocol, his men would no longer be alive. In America, strength is celebrated muscle, medals, parades broadcast with soaring music. But this story revealed something different. Sometimes the chronicles of survival are written by the unseen, by those hidden behind cold screens, people we so easily overlook in the crowd. In the weeks that followed, the halls of Coronado echoed with a half-joking refrain, "If the radios go silent, wait for Ghost 11." The phrase became an inside legend. Someone even printed a tiny ghost decal and slapped it onto a field radio, a way of laughing to disguise a quiet gratitude. Eleanor remained the same. She sat at her old desk, turning the compass out of habit. Her co-workers still thought her eccentric, but some glances toward her had changed. Less indifference, more a flicker of respect, though unspoken. Marcus, in a closed meeting, once tried to bring up the unidentified signal source that had saved his men. But the response from higher command was only a shrug, followed by the caution, "Best to let this pass." He knew that was how the system worked. Sometimes, victories too unusual would be buried, because they didn't fit the framework. But outside, within the American military community, a small flame had been lit. The story of Ghost 11 needed no official report, no press conference. It lived in the memories of those who had been saved, and in the whispered retellings spreading through barracks across the country. A few weeks later, the Coronado briefing room seemed to wear a new face. The dark wooden walls were still there, the familiar heavy scent of coffee still lingered, and the rows of rigid chairs still lined up neatly, but on the main wall, something unfamiliar had appeared. Not a flag, not a gleaming medal, just an old compass, sealed in a glass case. Its metal edges were chipped, its glass scratched, but beneath it, a single line was carved with precision. Competence is the only measure. There was no ceremony, no official honor. The compass appeared quietly, just as the one who once turned its needle in the dark had always remained quiet. Yet anyone who walked into the room understood. This was no mere display. It was a symbol of a battle that had nearly consumed them, and of an unseen hand that had pulled them back to life. No one spoke the name Eleanor Brooks. There was no inscription, no photograph, but in their hearts, everyone knew. Especially Marcus Hale. Each time his eyes lifted toward that compass, he saw again the image of his team sprinting through the night, and heard that steady female voice echo, "Ghost 11, on your 6." Within the barracks, the story of Ghost 11 was no longer a secret. It became the whispers in hallways, the tales retold at dinner, even woven into exhausted banter during grueling workouts. A young soldier once laughed, saying he had stuck a ghost decal on his radio. Just in case it died, maybe she'd come back. The joke made the squad laugh, but in every eye there flickered respect. On veterans forums, the phrase, "the 11th ghost," began to surface. Debates followed. Was it a daring analyst, a figure in intelligence, or even a guardian angel of the SEALs? Some doubted, dismissing it as an embellished tale. Yet the more it was argued, the deeper it rooted. What gave it life was not accuracy, but belief. Eleanor remained at her old desk, in the glow of blue screens. She did not seek recognition, nor the glare of any spotlight. Now and then, a colleague passing by would pause at the compass on her desk. Once they had called her the Shadow. Now some offered a small smile, a nod, a silent greeting, a muted acknowledgement. Others joked lightly, "Don't let her stay quiet too long, or the whole base might lose signal." Even those half-jesting words, beneath their humor, were a rare admission of value from a culture not prone to sentiment. Marcus knew in his heart that the greatest truth was not whether someone's name was carved in stone. The truth was this: An invisible voice had saved them from death, and that truth would echo long after. He remembered the first time he stood before the compass on the wall, and thought, sometimes, no face is needed, just a hand that grips firmly at the moment it matters most. In America, where people are accustomed to bronze statues etched with the names of heroes, this story left another kind of lesson, that some choose to remain unseen, and it is they who write the chapters of survival. And sometimes, a brief voice in the dark can be stronger than the loudest shout in a crowd. The compass still turned, its needle still pointing north. Ghost 11 had no face, no metal, but now she was a symbol. And somewhere, across frequencies thought to be silent, perhaps that steady voice still lingers, a reminder that in the most perilous moment, sometimes the only thing we need to trust is the calm of a human being who knows exactly what must be done. And you, my dear audience, brace yourselves for the next twist in this jaw-dropping story. So, before you get too cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're truly loving what I'm doing here. And drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a thrill to see who's joining us from all corners of the globe.